Tonight I'll be talking a little bit more specifically about what I'm terming Eco-Daemonology, or nature-spirit paradigms. I'll also be talking more generally about my book, what you can find in the book, some of the ideas that I have tried to sort of fit into. It's quite packed with a lot of different fields of study and inquiry that I've been engaged in for the past 20 years. I've been just a little bit of my background. I've been a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner, studying and practicing Tibetan Buddhism in some capacity for about 20 years. I am also a trained Tibetan medicine practitioner. I did a full course of study in the States and a medical internship in Nepal. So I've been studying that for about the past 11, 12 years. And I wanted to write this book initially with the intent of talking about unseen beings, which we speak about a lot in the Tibetan tradition and in many spiritual traditions and in many circles in the contemporary world as a sort of catch-all term for spirits of various kinds. And in reality, there is no good catch-all term for the kinds of beings that we categorize as so-called spirits. So I like this term unseen beings. It's what a lot of my teachers used. And I had set out really to write a book about Tibetan nature-spirit paradigms, with having that been a very important sort of basis of the work that I've done and the studies that I've done throughout my life. I was really intensively trained in Tibetan ritual arts. I studied with a Bhutanese Khenpo for a number of years and went really into quite a bit of depth on all of the intricacies of Tibetan Buddhist rituals, especially the Chud tradition, which is really my sort of spiritual foundation. However, it did end up evolving into something quite different from that. And really the title Unseen Beings, what it primarily means to me now, is really, it refers to an active process of unseeing. Unseen beings are not necessarily invisible beings that we cannot possibly perceive with our senses. In many, many cases, they are in fact actively unseen by us as beings. In most cases, especially the kinds of creatures and entities that I talk about in the book, they're perfectly perceptible. For the vast majority of human history, it would be preposterous to think that you can't see a tree spirit, for instance. Of course you can see a tree spirit. A tree spirit is fully embodied in a tree. As long as you look at a tree, you are observing the physical body of what we might call a tree spirit, whether we call them a dryad, or a yaksha, or a nyen, or what have you. So this unseeing of beings really became a central sort of question in my research. How did we unsee them? Why did we start unseeing non-human beings as beings? And it indeed became really quite comprehensive. I talk about anthropocentrism quite a bit in the book and sort of where that came from, because it's incredibly predominant today, even in very sort of scientific circles. I wrote an article in the Watkins magazine that came out last month where I reference an article that I came across. I forgot what the source is now, but you can see it in the magazine. But a scientific source, and it's talking about extraterrestrials and all of the hubbub about the potential discovery of extraterrestrial life. And the author says it would seem preposterous to think. I forgot what the exact wording is. I should have looked at it before I did this. But it seems preposterous to think that humans are the only living creatures in the universe, something to that extent. And it's really making this claim that until we discover extraterrestrial life, we must assume that human beings are the only living creatures in the cosmos. This is, of course, absurd. We're not even the only living beings in this room. I'm not the only living being inhabiting my body. There are countless microbes that are living in my gut and living on my skin that are also living beings. This tendency to automatically assume that human beings are the only real, authentic living creatures, and that everyone else is an object or a resource, or in spiritual circles maybe a god or a demon whose entire existence is still revolving around our humanness. This is quite absurd, but it's really prevalent, so I wanted to understand why we think that way. And I rehash some ground that's already been covered in exploring Platonic and Aristotelian philosophical movements in ancient Greece, the conception of the human soul, the rational human soul that supposedly differentiates us from every other species of life on Earth, and how that ended up progressing into the modern world. I talk about its inclusion in especially Christian theology, which eventually was later, brought into Islamic theology, and how folks like Rene Descartes then tried to bring a new sort of synthesis of Christian theology and Aristotelianism into the modern world, and how this really formed the foundation of modernity as we know it. A lot of our basic assumptions about the world that we tend to take for granted, even if we're very open-minded, even if we're interested in esoteric and occult and spiritual matters, we tend to take some of these assumptions for granted, and I think that that's really dangerous, particularly when we're entering into the Anthropocene. Entering is the wrong word. We've been in the Anthropocene for a while. We're already here. This is the Anthropocene. We can debate when exactly it began and what the circumstances were that determine its beginning, but we know that we're in it. But in my view, the Anthropocene is very much founded upon Anthropocentrism. That is what brought us into the Anthropocene. We can't just blame fossil fuels. We can't just blame, radioactive pollution. We need to really understand the underlying cultural and philosophical and ideological basis of this very anthropocentric and anthropocenic era of our human. A lot of what this book does, the subtitle is How We Forgot the World is More Than Human, and I try as best as I can to explain that, going from our distant prehistory when everyone across the globe was animistic by default, which I I consider to be really our natural state. Kids are automatically animists. Other animals are automatically animists. We are all animists by default. An animist being, in the sort of new animism school, Graham Harvey's work, etc., specifically a paradigm of relationship, a way of living in the world with the full recognition that the world is full of many kinds of persons and that only a very few of those are human. It doesn't, unlike what folks like Edward Tyler believed, father of anthropology, animism's just about the belief in spirits and so on, that isn't really what it is. It's not the belief that every rock is a sentient being. However, it is holding open the possibility that some rocks may potentially be sentient beings, and certainly that plants and trees and animals are sentient beings, and that mountains and rivers and lakes and oceans can also have their own subjective personhood that may be very foreign to us, may be very strange to us, but is nevertheless a form of subjective experience. This is ultimately what animism is in the sort of modern academic understanding of the term. And this is, as opposed to what Edward Tyler claimed about animism, that it was the first religion, or more specifically in his view, the first sort of departure from reason. It was the first delusion that snowballed into religion. That's been largely disproven. It is tremendously ancient. It's tremendously primordial, but it's not a religion per se. It's not a belief system. It's our natural way of experiencing the world, accepting the possibility that non-human beings are meaningfully alive. So from that into where we are today, I try to sort of lay that out, tell that story, and explain how that happened, bringing in philosophical movements, specifically Western philosophical movements, because these are really the foundation for some of these very dangerous, toxic myths, and the ways that those ended up becoming very important for the proliferation of especially Western religion. However, that is not what I'm mainly going to talk about tonight, because I really want to talk about Tibetan Eco-Daemonology, or Tibetan nature spirits, and sort of a different approach perhaps to the idea of animism or the idea of spirits in general. I think it's really important to understand, especially as someone who probably, like a lot of you, is very interested in what we might call nature-based spirituality, earth-based spirituality. I certainly, especially over the past 5 years, have had a really significant turn in my own spiritual life, away from more organized sort of religious constructs and back towards the earth itself and to other beings. That's been really important for me throughout my entire life since I was very young. It's part of what brought me to Buddhism in the first place. My love of dogs ended up being a really important part of that process. That's why I have dogs on my shirt tonight. Also, Tolkien was a really important part of my sort of awakening to enchantment, that spark of inspiration that set me on my spiritual path. So there have been elements of this that have always been present, but for a long time I was quite traditionalist and somewhat fundamentalist in my approach to Tibetan Buddhism, but that has lightened up a little bit over the past few years. However, there's a lot of insights that can be found in the Buddhist tradition as a whole, but especially in the Tibetan tradition, that I really think are valuable and worth considering in a serious way. Not as a cultural idea or a cultural tradition that we can appropriate and put on like a costume, or that we can respect as a cultural tradition, but as a legitimate form of knowledge that we can engage with seriously and critically, and be able to understand potentially our own world a little bit better through that. I think it's important for us to go beyond this idea of nature-based spirituality, because I think it's important for us to go beyond the idea of nature itself. We need to understand that outside of Western cultural and linguistic traditions, there is no word for nature in the vast majority of the world, the vast majority of cultures, for the vast majority of human history. The idea that there is an undifferentiated domain out there, the place with the trees and the grass and the mountains and the nature, the natural world, and that is a unified, undifferentiated whole that is in opposition to humanity, and that this is the nature of the cosmos, this is the nature of our Earth, is that there's humanity on one side and nature on the other. There's culture and there's nature. This is strictly a Western philosophical notion. It isn't even that old. It isn't even that old. The original term nature, natura or physis in the Greek tradition, this referred to the nature of a thing. It didn't refer to an undifferentiated non-human domain that's somewhere out there. This idea evolved over time, and it really only became crystallized during the Enlightenment era. And it formed a significant basis for our entire perception of the world. Nature is not the human domain. Humans are the ones with the rational human soul. We're the ones who are meaningful living beings. Out there we find resources. We find inert biological automata. We find exploitable resources that we can claim and use for our own enrichment and our own progress. And this was really the foundation of modernity. This was the foundation of the colonial project as a whole. European colonization was really founded upon this, except also a lot of humans were rejected from the master identity that had been constructed as the sort of peak of everything, which for a lot of European history has been specifically white men and no one else, and that was really instated by Plato and Aristotle themselves. But these sorts of ideologies, even though a lot of us might be very critical of these ways of thinking, we tend to not let those critiques actually change our ways of living. And we can see this really clearly in the development of a lot of the traditions which I find very fascinating, probably a lot of us find very fascinating, including Western spiritualism and theosophy. We're here at Watkins. These movements were themselves not unfounded on the same principles. They didn't reject the premise, for instance, that nature is disenchanted. Instead, they just said, okay, sure, nature is disenchanted, but then there's the supernatural. There's a separate domain, there's a separate dimension, there's a different kind of world filled with wondrous mystical beings who are not natural, they're supernatural, and we'll focus on them. That was a concession that was made to the sort of modernist thinking at the basis of modernity and the Enlightenment. We didn't need to accept that wager. We could have rejected that and said, actually, I disagree with your premise that nature is disenchanted. I disagree with your premise that the non-human world is devoid of agency, is devoid of magic, is devoid of wonder, is devoid of subjectivity. But we didn't. So today, we still are heir to those acceptances. We are still heir to these traditions that create a divide between the natural and the supernatural, that tell us that meaning is not found in the former. Magic magic is not found in the former, it's only in the latter. And it's in this context that a lot of our ideas about spirits have been constructed. And then we project these onto the past. We project these onto ancient cultures and prehistoric peoples and say, well, they must have thought basically the same things. They understood that nature is this domain of resources, but then there were spirits and gods and demons that inhabited that world, and those were the ones that people were engaging with. That wasn't always the case. It was frequently the case that nature itself was the domain of magic and mystery and spirited beings and subjective experience. The natural world was that. And in a lot of cases, what we refer to as nature spirits were in fact just the living, subjective persons that were embedded and embodied in topographic features and non-human beings themselves. And this was very much the case in the Tibetan tradition. And there was a great talk here a couple of weeks ago with Dmitry Ermakov on his book, Bun, which is around here somewhere. And he talks about this quite a bit because he did a lot of research into the Bun tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, which is actually many things. There is no one, or not Tibetan Buddhism, of Tibetan spirituality. There are many Buns, but the most ancestral form of it that actually predated the introduction of Buddhism to Tibet shares a lot with Siberian shamanism in the Buryat tradition, Morgal, and also some of the other traditions found across northern Eurasia. And you can see this differentiation. In older traditions, for instance, you'll often find that lakes and mountains and trees and forests are themselves regarded as living beings. They are the spirits. They are the gods. Not all gods are lakes and mountains, but some of them are. Whereas in later, especially Indic-derived traditions like Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism in particular, and also New Bun, that shifted so that an enchanted lake was no longer a living being or a god itself, but the abode of nature spirits, the abode of lake spirits, water spirits. It took place not just in the West, also in the East. But it's important that we understand the dynamics underlying it, because if we want to be able to one, decolonize our approaches to spirituality, and if we want to come into a more authentic and earnest and honest relationship with the world around us, then we need to recognize some of the missteps that I think we've made historically in trying to make sense of them in pursuit of an anthropocentric kind of ontology, which is what we have today. So there's another aspect of this where this book, I'm a student of, my root teacher in Tibetan Buddhism is a woman by the name of Lama Tsultrim Allione. Some folks may have read her book, Women of Wisdom, or Feeding Your Demons. She also has a book called, Wisdom Rising. That's her most recent one. And her book, Feeding Your Demons, is a very important book, I think. A lot of people have been incredibly moved by it, based on the teachings of Machik Lapchen, who is an 11th century matriarch in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, a real historical person, which is not always the case in the Tibetan tradition. Some of the most important visionary figures in the Tibetan tradition are legendary mythic figures. They are not historical persons. Machik Lapchen is an absolute historical person, and her approach to animism in a Buddhist world, in a Tibet that had already become Buddhicized, that was already very much beholden to Indian paradigms of authority, is fascinating and very different from some of the other stories that you find in the Tibetan tradition. In Tibet, it's very common to find stories, for instance, of Indian gurus coming to Tibet and wrathfully, forcefully exorcising the Tibetan landscape of all of the evil demons and spirits that were causing problems, most of whom were just trying to avoid having a new religion come in and usurp them from their position of reverence in Tibetan culture. And many stories are constructed to demonstrate that these great Indian masters who could fly and shoot lightning bolts out of their hands and turn people into stone and so on, that they came to Tibet and they wrathfully liberated all the demons, killed them with their purbas, imprisoned them in rock piles, stuck stupas on top of them, and in doing so they subdued the Tibetan landscape and converted everyone to Buddhism. This is the story. And Buddhists take this very seriously. Tibetan Buddhists take this very, very, very seriously. To say anything against this narrative is quite scandalous. So, but this is a myth. This is a myth that is furthermore used specifically in a kind of colonial process intended to perpetuate mass conversion to a new religion, to instate a hierarchy, to demonstrate the suppression of gods and spirits that had long been a part of indigenous cultures there. And it's a bit messy. It's a bit problematic. Machik Leptrin's position was completely different. She completely rejected the idea that you can take spirit beings and non-human beings and reduce them to gods and demons, as in exemplars or symbols of absolute good and absolute evil. She makes the point that there's no foundation for this in Buddhism. Any living sentient being is morally ambiguous by nature. We all have Buddha nature, but we are also all affected by our lived experience. We have afflictive mental states. We have our desires and our anger and our own karma to deal with. And this must be the same for all of those spirits that are supposedly trapped under mounds of stone in the Himalayas. And she was really taking a completely different approach. Her approach was that we need to feed and take care of these beings, to develop compassion for them, instead of attempting to destroy them. Instead of reducing the so-called demons of the Tibetan landscape to demons, to evil creatures that have to be eradicated, she instead said, treat them like your children. Feed them your own flesh and blood, not literally, but through visualization. Imagine that you have so much deep love and compassion for them that you offer them your very body for their own satisfaction and their own liberation. It was a completely different approach. And she makes an important distinction here between especially kinds of ideas of gods and devils, devils being dut in Tibetan or mara in Sanskrit, versus the so-called Lasen Degye, or the 8 classes of gods and spirits found on the Tibetan plateau and found in Buddhism as a whole. There are actually hundreds of different classes. That's just a symbolic number, but they're a very common idea in Tibet. And she says these are different things. Those creatures out there, the so-called 8 classes, the so-called gods and demons, all the spirits, the La and the Du and the Mamos and the Terangs and the Gyalpos and the Sinmo, all of these creatures, those are sentient beings. They are not absolute good or absolute evil. There's no such thing. They all have their own Buddha nature. They all have their own lives. Our orientation to them, if we want to live an authentic sort of, compassionate life, is to treat them with love and compassion. That's our approach with them. Don't turn them into gods and demons, because that's not going to help anyone. Just have compassion for them and try to live in right relationship with them. This very much includes all of the so-called nature spirits that we might talk about. On the other side, she says, devils, du, maras, those don't exist outside of your mind. Those are strictly mental constructions. Anything that inhibits your ability to be free, that inhibits your experience of liberation, that is a devil, that is a du, that is a mara. They're not some, Machik says specifically in her text, a devil isn't some great big black thing that wanders around and harms everyone that sees it and tries to scare everyone. A du is simply anything that hinders our experience of liberation. That's a really significant and important insight, I think, into the nature of so-called gods and demons. Because it's the same for gods. Gods don't exist outside of ourselves in Buddhism. There are the devas or the hla, the official sort of gods that are bound to cyclic existence, but they're like us. They're just living a different kind of life, some of them in a different place, others not. But in the Buddhist tradition, they're not the creators or the absolute, sort of judges of the universe. They're just other beings. But the hla and the du, the gods and devils that are spoken about philosophically, those are mental constructs. And this is really what Lama Tsultrim's book, Feeding Your Demons, talks about, because she uses this and applies it to a more psychological paradigm, explaining that our gods and demons are in us. Our demons are our addictions. They're our, our unmitigated traumas. They're the things that we tend to push into the dark recesses of our psyche and not deal with, or we try to fight, we try to battle with. And instead of doing that, we need to feed them. We need to give them what they need. We need to recognize them as fragmented aspects of our own psyche. That's a very important insight. However, there has been a tendency, and this isn't just with Feeding Your Demons. Lama Tsultrim's very careful about explaining what it is she's talking about. But for hundreds of years, there has been a tendency in Western academia, in Western Buddhism, in sort of Buddhist apologetics, in the world at large, to say Buddhism is a non-supernaturalist religion. Buddhism is a very rational science of the mind. It's a philosophy. There's nothing about it that has rules or which is absolutely not true. There's no rules, there's no, sort of beliefs, there's no gods and demons, there's no spirits. All of that stuff is just, external influences or just metaphors. This is nonsense. This is very much Victorian era, Western, Eurocentric kinds of ideologies that were largely used to demonstrate that India in their golden age philosophically were so sophisticated, but then they became so backwards with all of these supernaturalist ideas in Hindu traditions, and that was specifically used as a justification to, go in and colonize India. That was an important justification for the domination of the British Raj. That's a really problematic idea, and it has a lot of very problematic colonial history behind it. But even though academics now reject that, a lot of people still think some of these things about Buddhism. They still tend to think that Buddhism, the original Buddhism, essential Buddhism, is non-supernaturalist, it's super rational, it's totally in line with like quantum physics, it's in line with modern science, everything about it is, you don't have to believe anything because it's all just true. This isn't the case. Buddhism is very much full of beliefs, full of myths, full of vows, full of rules, full of superstitions, and very much full of spirits. And I'm not saying that spirits are irrational, but they are certainly there. And to think that they're simply exteriorizations of mental afflictions or symbols of afflictive mental states is disingenuous. Devils are externalizations of afflictive mental states. Gods, in an absolute sense with a big G, those are externalizations of mental states. Those are mental constructs. But other beings, so-called nature spirits, they have absolutely always existed from the very beginning of Buddhism, and far before that, reaching all the way back into the Vedic era, and way before that into Proto-Indo-Europeans, and way before that into animistic cultures around the world. This has always been a foundational understanding that almost all humans have had. The world is not just human. It is vastly more than human. And to be human in it is to learn how to be in relationship with many other kinds of beings. Not to reduce them to resources, not to reduce them to gods and demons, not to try to exploit them or try to destroy them, but to live in relationship with them. That's really, I think, an important part of spirituality, but more specifically or more generally a part of our work as humans in the 21st century that we really can't overlook. When we're dealing with something as significant as global catastrophic climate change, caused by a lot of the same ideologies that I talk about in this book, we need to take those ideologies really seriously, and we need to deconstruct them. We need to figure out where they came from and find ways to dismantle them and replace them with something that is actually a lot more sensible and rational. My hope is, with this book, is to start some of those kinds of conversations. I've been told I only have a half hour, and this has been a half hour, which goes really fast, and I'm not really known for succinctness. But let me just give you a really brief, I promise this will be brief, overview of what is in the book. There's a lot of stuff in the book, and I take a lot of different approaches in it. It's basically broken into 4 sections based on traditional medical ontologies, which were actually used by the Buddha in his original teaching on the Four Noble Truths. A lot of folks know those. There is suffering, the root of suffering is desire or clinging or ignorance, depends on who you ask, that there is an end to suffering, and that the end of suffering is brought about through the Eightfold Path. That's a medical paradigm. The first is diagnosis. The diagnosis is everyone has a case of the suffering. The etiology, the causes and conditions of that disease, are ignorance or desire or clinging, depending on who you ask. The prognosis is that there is a potential end to suffering, and the treatment is the Eightfold Path. This is a very old paradigm. The Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, used that intentionally as a medical paradigm to make sense of the affliction that all beings, all sentient beings have. And I really like the paradigm, especially as a Tibetan medicine scholar and practitioner. So I use that in the book. So the first section is diagnosis, talking about the can I say clusterfuck that we're in right now? Because that's it. Talking about the Anthropocene, talking about catastrophic climate change, dealing with these issues head on and looking at it really soberly, that's the diagnosis. Then I talk about the causes and conditions, how we got into this situation in the first place, looking at both what the healthy state would look like, and then that helps us better understand what the unhealthy state looks like. So I talk about the trajectory of anthropocentrism and these very exploitative and destructive ideologies throughout history. I then talk about prognosis, discussing, what things are likely to look like in the future. It's the shortest section of the book because that's quite dark and a lot of other people have covered it. But I also talk about Tibetan medicine in that and Tibetan medical approaches to things like COVID-19, pandemics, which are very much understood in Tibetan medicine to be directly linked to environmental desecration and also directly linked to so-called nature-spirit paradigms. So that's an interesting section. And then the fourth is treatment. And the treatment is really trying to lay out a suggested method or some suggestions, it's certainly not comprehensive, to try to help us recover a sense of what it really means to be human in a more than human world. And that sense of recovery is, I think, really important. I actually take this term specifically from Tolkien. He has an excellent essay which I recommend that everyone reads. It's called On Fairy Stories. And it's an academic essay. He was an Oxford professor as well as a writer. Brilliant essay on fairy stories, which he identifies as a very intimate, sort of earnest form of myth, and their function in human societies and in the human psyche. And in his view, the function of fairy story, a story with the capacity to enchant us, is to do three things: to facilitate recovery, both in the sense of a return and renewal of health, in his words, but also the sense of recovering a clear view. The view not necessarily of things as they truly essentially are, but the way that we are meant to see them, namely seeing other beings as others, apart from ourselves, as other creatures, other entities with their own lives and their own subjective experience, and to be in relationship with them. The second thing that fairy story provides is escape. We talk a lot about escapism in terms of fantasy literature and mythology and entertainment of various forms and storytelling. Escape is not necessarily a bad thing when what we are escaping from is a prison. In Tolkien's view, enchanting literature, stories, mythology, the stories that give us what Campbell calls the rapture of being alive, those stories that inspire us, that light that spark, that gives us a real sense of what it means to be alive and what gives life what makes life worth living. Those stories help us to escape from the ontological shackles of instrumentalism, of anthropocentrism, of these broken ideologies that are completely out of step with the real nature of things. So in his view, these stories don't help us, they don't push us to escape from reality. We escape into reality through them. And I think that stories are tremendously important if we want to make it through the Anthropocene in any way. We need new stories. We need to critically analyze the old stories and toss some of them in the bin. And we need to develop new stories that can give us some guideposts on our trajectory through the world that we are now living in. So the third aspect of the fairy stories is consolation, and I talk about consolation a little bit in the book. I won't go into it now. But these first two features of recovery and escape are very important to me. And I think this idea of recovery is a lot more workable than some of the other MOs that have been suggested for more sort of environmental activistic movements. We tend to prioritize things like sustainability. That's the common goal. That's the buzzword, is that we need to be more sustainable. But we rarely question what it is we're actually trying to sustain. The reality is that what we want to sustain in a perfect world, if all of the politicians get their way, if all of the CEOs get their way, is to sustain our current model of exploitation in such a way that it doesn't have to end. That's what we want to sustain. And we really need to question how wise that truly is. We certainly need to divest from fossil fuels. We certainly need to stop doing some of the incredibly polluting and destructive things that we are doing. However, if our whole plan is centered around replacing fossil fuels with a renewable source of clean energy, we're going to run into the same exact problems time and time again because we've never dealt with the root cause. We don't need to try to fix the world with our human ingenuity. We don't need to try to enforce even more control, more dominance, more power. We need to recognize that actually we need to pull back quite a bit. We need to pull back from our lust for dominance. We need to recover ourselves as humans, what it means to be a living being in a living world. And that is hopefully something that folks will take away from this book. And I hope that it starts some conversations about these kinds of things and pushes us to think a bit differently about maybe even some of the ideas and beliefs that we've held very dearly in our lives. Questions. We have a few minutes for questions, and I would love for folks to ask them. So please feel free. The thing with this book is I talk about a lot in it. I talk about biology, I talk about plant neurobiology, which I find really fascinating. If you like The Hidden Life of Trees and Suzanne Simard's work, then there's a lot of that in here. I talk about mycorrhizal fungal networks and so on. I talk about animism, religion, philosophy, Tibetan medicine, Buddhism, myth, Tolkien. I have a whole chapter that's mostly about Tolkien. So there's a lot in here for a lot of different folks, whatever sort of direction you're coming from. So it's hard to talk about succinctly, but I tried. There's one back there first. Yeah. Yeah.
What's your opinions on suffering?
Yeah.
Is that really is essential of what we're considering?
Absolutely. So there's the question of the suffering that humans cause, and the fact that we really rarely talk about that directly. And asking whether I'll talk about that in my next book. I actually do talk about that quite a bit in this book. That was a big inspiration for wanting to talk about the environment and the climate in the first place. I'm always really troubled when we talk about the environmental situation as potential future human risk. That the main concern is that we will run out of resources or we'll destroy our home. The word ecology, I don't know if people know this, the word ecology, eco, is derived from Greek oikos, which means house or home. And originally, in the sort of Linnaean era, the study of nature was termed economy. That was the original term for the study of what we call nature. That eventually became ecology, and economy became something very much connected to that, but with a slightly different connotation. But these terms are not dissimilar. They're not unrelated. Our conception of ecology and nature is intimately linked to the concept of resources and exploitation and commodification of the so-called natural world. And this is really problematic for precisely this reason, because we rarely consider the fact that the beings that we're exploiting and using as quote-unquote resources are themselves capable of suffering. They are themselves victims in these processes. And furthermore, a hell of a lot of humans have been victims in these processes. Humans have been radically exploited in all of this as well. It's certainly not the case that the greatest disasters associated with the Anthropocene are coming in the future. They've already happened. Over 50 million Native American peoples were killed in the 16th century alone through European colonization. Over 50 million. That was already an apocalypse. Apocalypses have been happening over and over and over again. Catherine Youssef says that we need to acknowledge either a billion black Anthropocenes or none at all. And this is incredibly true. But this is true for humans, and it is also very true and remains very true for non-humans as well. The destruction of the Amazon isn't just the destruction of the Earth's lungs. It's certainly not that, actually. And it's not just the destruction of a human habitat. It's the destruction of countless beings, countless forms of life. It's causing massive amounts of suffering every single second of every day. And I don't personally think that we're ever going to compel ourselves to find solutions to this if we keep talking about it in terms of resources. We need to genuinely foster and nourish and invoke a sense of empathy and compassion for non-human beings themselves. I think that's absolutely essential. Val Plumwood makes this point in her book, Feminism and the Mastery of Nature, another brilliant book, that actually environmental ethics are very poorly dealt with in terms of morality and ethics the way that we think of them. It's not just about coming up with better rules. It's not just a matter of saying, well, we shouldn't do this because it's bad. We really need to come down to a relational level. We need to really negotiate these things on an interpersonal basis. The same way that you don't avoid killing your neighbor just because it's illegal. Hopefully. If you do, then you might be a serial killer. But hopefully that's not the case. We generally avoid causing harm to other people because we don't want them to suffer. That is the most authentic manifestation of quote-unquote. And I think that that's a much more valuable and workable foundation for these kinds of ecological conversations as well. It's not just a matter of we need better laws. We do need better laws. Damn right we need better laws. But we need to individually negotiate these things on a personal, relational basis, not on a moral basis, if that makes sense.
Another question?
I think you had your hand up a second ago.
Where do you stand in relation to AI?
AI is fascinating. I talked about this in an interview recently because I think it's really interesting. I won't go too far into it because we don't have a lot of time, but the one thing I'll say about AI is I think it is incredibly telling that humans are a bit closer to recognizing machines as sentient beings and algorithms as sentient beings than we are in recognizing pigs or cows or chickens or any other animals or plants or microbes or fungi as sentient beings. They're our cousins. They're literally our biological kin. If we trace our own lineage, we talk about ancestors, yada yada, if you track your ancestry far enough back, the vast majority of your ancestors were not human beings. The vast majority of every one of our ancestors weren't even mammals. They weren't even animals. We are not just, it's not just humans and everyone else. We are a part of a whole family of many forms of life, all of whom we have to assume have some basic degree of awareness, or what we would call awareness, or rikpa in Tibetan, or consciousness, or sentience in a most basic form. So I think AI is fascinating. Who knows? I'm open to the possibility that AI could potentially be identifiable as sentient. However, I'm not concerned about that at the moment, and I think it's really problematic that so many people are quicker to assume that AI is intelligent than their stake is. And I think the reason for that is, and it's very important that we recognize this, we only really recognize intelligence if it looks like us. That's what we care about. Our whole concept of a gradation of intelligent with higher and lower intelligences, that's purely based on who is the closest to humans, who's the most like us. We don't recognize that it's much more of a spectrum. It's a very diverse and complex spectrum of intelligence. It's not a linear, gradation of high and low intelligence. But with AI, because we've designed it to look a lot like us and to speak like us and to think like us, we say, AI is brilliant, good for us. We made an intelligent, sentient, non-biological being. Good question.
I was just wondering, what do you think there's hope for us in the Anthropocene? Do you think there's a light at the end of the tunnel? Because I think it's very easy for people to get really nihilistic about this stuff. Mm-hmm. So, using that foundation of Tibetan Buddhism and seeing spirit and life in things which we wouldn't normally see, do you think there's hope for people that we can actually go towards that?
No. Unfortunately, no. But it depends on how we think about it. And that's why I talk about recovery as opposed to talking about fixing the climate or, saving the environment, saving the planet, and so on. It's an idea that you can find very clearly in Tolkien's work. I like to refer to him because myth is important. This is how we understand the world. It's our operating system for understanding the world. Sauron's intent in creating the One Ring, in his own view, was to save Middle-earth. It was to fix everything that had been done by Morgoth. This is actually told very beautifully in the Amazon series, The Rings of Power. But that desire to control, or that desire to save and to heal, is very close to a desire to control. And that was his approach. This is where we are as human beings, I think. Our assumption is that we need to control in order to heal and save. But it's a slippery slope from a desire to save to a desire to exploit and to dominate, and we have to be very careful of that. When it comes to what the future holds for us, I do not think that we're going to magically, end up in some sort of a utopia. I think shifting the terms of what we're expecting, what we want our course of treatment to lead to, is important. And this is where the idea of escape for me comes in. And I think this is nicely related, for instance, with the Maroon communities in the Americas, which were communities of enslaved peoples, specifically enslaved Africans, that escaped enslavement, fled into the hills, fled into the forests, ran far away from European settlements, in many cases linking up with indigenous peoples and forming these clandestine sort of communities in the forests, in the wild, operating outside of the bounds of these European societies, these European colonial societies. They didn't stop colonization, they didn't stop slavery, unfortunately, but they were able to escape from that system and create new life in the cracks of a crumbling world. And that is the kind of mentality that I think we all need to have. No one of us is going to fix everything. I would love to think that by publishing a book like this that, I don't know, Joe Biden or someone is going to read it and all of a sudden all of our problems are fixed. Of course that's not going to happen. But what I hope to be able to do is, our world is crumbling. It is absolutely crumbling. We are in late stage capitalism. We can see the cracks. All that we can hope to do, in my opinion, is to nourish the new life that can grow from that, to create little pockets of sanity and recovery within those cracks. So that's what I hope for, that we can all create our own sort of maroon communities, not to appropriate that concept, but it's really valuable to think of in this way in the world that we're currently living in. I don't think that we need to be pessimistic, but I also don't think that the only reason that life is worth living is in hopes that we'll have progress in the future. We need to live well, not necessarily better. That needs to be our aim. We don't need constant growth, constant progress, constant expansion. We need to get down to the basics of what makes life worth living. And we'll find that that has a lot to do with relationship, with enchantment, with the spark of beauty and wonder that comes from a meeting of minds. And that's not just human minds. So we can go out, meet the trees, meet the plants, meet the animals, look at your dogs and cats as persons, be able to accept that all of the feelings that you feel intrinsically are valid. They are persons. Every creature that you encounter in your life is a person in their own way. And it's likely not even restricted to biological organisms. So yeah, sorry for the pessimistic answer to that, but that is how I feel, unfortunately.
Thank you.